Hey, microphone on, okay. Just actually came out to water the garden and noticed it was a little bit wilty, and it's pretty nice out today, so I thought I'd sit down, kind of just on the way back in. And as I sat down, I started thinking about some ideas I'd like to talk about. Really kind of a quick thing, even though I say that oftentimes. I'm pretty honest about telling you when it's going to be a lot, and sometimes it is. But this is simple, and I might take it into something a little bit deeper than you thought of before about the subject, so it'll probably be useful. I'm expecting so. About respecting of persons, that God, James telling us that God is not a respecter of persons. I went in and got my camera and came back out and hooking on my microphone and that kind of stuff, and thinking back, my brother, best friend's kind of brother, he passed away 2013. No. Yeah? No, time goes by. Guess it's been a while now. But I remembered, as I was kind of sitting down here and I was thinking about the subject and everything, I was going to, and I started to think about him being bothered by that subject and the way people toss the statement out like it was some kind of a rule. And I was kind of trying to think of the actual offense that it had for him. I knew it was very unclear, that he thought things were, how do you say it? That people were stupid about what they thought about things involving that. And what people try to say about God not respecting persons is that God thinks everybody sucks, and that's not what it means at all. And respect is a kind of an interesting word, actually, and think about the derivation or the origin of it. I don't need to do research to be able to figure it out. It's a prefix and a root. Spect means look at, and re means look again. So it means respecting means to look maybe a second time, or maybe continuing to look at something till you get the full value and import of that thing. If you inspect something, you're going to look at it carefully to find out what the properties of it are. And if you respect it, then you're going to do that again. You're going to look at it and decide about the properties of it. So when it says that God doesn't respect persons, it's not saying that God doesn't respect men, because men have been deceived into believing that persons and man are the same thing. But a man and a person are not the same thing. They're different. And what they're talking about when they say persons is goes back to the definition of the word. And you might have heard before, you might have heard me say before, that persons is like an actor's mask. It's like a role that an actor puts on. It's a feigned artifice in the sense of it not being the real man who is behaving as that person. It's a role that they put on. And so the roles that men put on, God does not look again at the roles as if they need to be further valued or higher valued. He doesn't care about the roles we put on. So when it says that he doesn't respect persons, it does not mean that he doesn't respect men, that he doesn't think well of them, or that he doesn't look again or value them enough to consider them and to keep his his ever-present eye on them because of his love for them. I'm actually set up. I'm waiting for the right opportunity and the right quiet, and feeling up to what I expect to be the best thing I've ever done on video. And the most important thing, I have outlined on my large whiteboard. Not large enough, actually. I really could use a classroom with an 8-foot whiteboard on the wall. I would love that. I don't have much money left, but I probably would pay for that if I could do it. But anyway, I'd written about the remission of sins, and I'm going to talk about during that. I'm going to talk about the cloud of witnesses and what witnesses do, and basically who they are, and what we should think about what it means that we're surrounded by them. Because and what's going to get refuted in there, why I kind of shifted over to talk about that, is the idea that God and heaven are in a surveillance mode like a bunch of invisible narcs waiting to try and rat people out for any kind of mistakes they make or any kind of errors they do. That's based in believing that sin has to do with behavior problems and not doing well enough. That's something piously enough or holily enough to please God. And so people have this idea that every righteousness and life and mankind are based in, well, that shit table's probably shaking like crazy, sorry about that, are based in ideas of failure. I hope I tied the sentences together right. Everybody thinks that everything's failed. I think men start condemned, which is not true. Men become condemned when they break their righteousness by harming someone, and that fix is only a one-moment judgment away from being fixed for them. And men should be presuming that righteousness is the way that men live and is what they're designed to do, and they're able to do it, and it's not impossible, because all you have to do, well, not all you have to do potentially, maybe, but what you can do to fix that in yourself is really pay attention and figure out that there's no rules outside of you that bind on you. That you can't break rules from the outside of you because none of them are real to you. You love your neighbor as yourself because the law is written in your heart. If you're a believer and you've been justified, then you should be expecting that you're righteous and that you're not harming. Therefore, you're not sinning. Therefore, you're not a sinner, and you should expect righteousness and doing well and doing in love and in equality and the proper measure of your brother, treating them not only good enough but perfectly well enough because they're free and you don't bind on them, and so many of those things. The idea that things are condemned all the time is what the basis is for thinking that God and all of the resources that he can muster are like the state surveilling you, like the NSA from heaven. And those ideas come from looking at false authority and transferring that false authority's intrusions into men's liberties onto God, and God has no interest in that. God has never intruded on a man's liberty one time. He cares if you harm people, and he expects you to be free to live and to love and to do well anyway. And that doesn't have to do with any status or any gains that you've had in your life, any roles that you've managed to get permission to put on, like you become important in some area. God doesn't look at the roles you put on as if it's important. He looks straight through it. It reminds you of the verses about that men look on the outside and God looks on the heart. Well, the world looks on the outside, and men who are righteous and who measure properly, and God, they look on the inside and on the heart, and they look at whether men are loving their neighbor as themselves, or are they harming him. And when they're harming him, it matters. When they're not harming him, it doesn't matter, because they're free, because there's no laws that bind on them. So the idea that God thinks more of someone or less of someone because of the way they behave is broken by this idea that God does not respect persons. Behaviors are external in that sense. They're like the role put on. If you're an actor and they tell us that where that comes from is only men were allowed to be actors at some point. And if one of them was going to play the part of a woman, they would put on a woman mask and they would behave themselves as if they were a woman. And that was their person, their role, their persona that they had affixed to themselves for a certain purpose, really, at a certain time, and and positions in I won't say in authority because that would be the wrong word, but like positions in the world. I've been when I went to Weyerhaeuser to grade lumber, I was going there to perform the persona of a lumber grader, although at my nature I wasn't a lumber grader. At my nature I was a man, and the persona that was there for me had to do with dealing with the arrangement in commerce that I was involved with, that they were paying me for. They would pay me to come and do the role of a lumber grader for a certain amount of hours, and then I'd go home, and I wouldn't be a lumber grader at home, although it might be on my mind and those kinds of things, or I might talk about it potentially. Just like any actor is going to have their role on their mind, but it doesn't make the role who they are. What's a perfect example? Like Clint Eastwood isn't Dirty Harry. Clint Eastwood is an actor who plays Dirty Harry. So God isn't going to judge Clint Eastwood by a Dirty Harry judgment. He's going to expect to watch him and care about how he measures and how he loves and what he allows for and does. It's I got to be so careful about the words, because you'll take it back to, oh yeah, but he is talking about doing bad things or not doing well enough. No, God doesn't care about the roles you play and the actions that you take to do those. He doesn't hate them. He doesn't love them. He doesn't look at them because he doesn't look back at that because he doesn't value the differences. The reason God doesn't value the differences is because he created men equal and gave them life and liberty, all of them, in their nature as a man, never at someone else's permission or the discretion to remove the permission to be what they are. He gave them life and liberty to be themselves and to behave themselves in a just fashion where they don't allow themselves to make bad judgments of their neighbor and then therefore decide that he's worthy to move and harm him. God cares about people being safe and secure in their rights, and he worries when they're harmed. And I also touched on God judges, so you're going to find out pretty soon that God really doesn't judge. I think I'm going to show you and fairly clearly and explain to you why that we don't see God judging. I was thinking of the silly superstition, writing on the wall, old song from probably the 60s, I don't know, maybe 70s. Silly superstitions, writing on the wall. And I was thinking about the writing on the wall story from Daniel. I'll think about it a little bit more. Whether that shows God actually judging someone, or whether that story is developed to show a theology of that and does that vision happen that way? When you think about a king and an emperor, it's not going to possibly be being judged on how well you behaved as a king and an emperor, because the issue is that you bound people into your service and you murdered them for not obeying you. And that is going to have you weighed in a balance. And whether God weighs you in that balance or whether others weigh you in that balance might be worth considering. But it's really tough to find a place in the scripture that if you're not presuming that God is judging men and that he's their judge, that you would recognize by finding out that Jesus is a judge as a man and not as God, that once you realize that, you'll start to catch that men are the judges. And and I'm still, the message of the remission of sin things is growing in me, I guess. So I want to kind of go after that. But respected persons is simple for us to recognize that God does not recognize a difference between you and another. He doesn't recognize a difference in your performance. In the roles that you play as performance, but also in your ability to perform things. Neither of those things are something that God regards and measures and carefully looks at. He doesn't care about those performance issues, whether they be performing or whether they be doing well enough for someone's ideas about what God might want from them. What God wants from them is communion with the man. He wants to be within him and to correct him gently from within when he needs to be corrected, and he wants to see that man measure his neighbor properly, take heed how he measures, and to love his neighbor as himself or as equal and not harm him. And when God has endowed men with rights, what God cares about is that rights don't get destroyed by others, that liberties don't get bound by someone who has taken on themselves a God-like role or persona of pretending to be in charge of someone's liberties. They're not. And when they move to harm them, then they're worthy of being forced to stop it and being disabled from continuing that, no matter how important they seem to be or how much people give them credit or value them out in unequal measures, and they value them as being greater and then therefore worthy to make the lesser men obey them, those kinds of things. God does not respect those roles. And so, he doesn't believe in them. Men believe in them, and then the world is fashioned by making differences between men and placing some under the others as if they're servants. And how do you go from a free man that God had given full life and liberty to at your nature, in your birth, and in your nature as a man? How did you go from free to servile and being bound by someone? How that happened is someone harmed you, and that role that they take on is not something that God gives them credit for having that right or privilege to do that to others. Now, whether that there's going to be judgment and there's going to be destruction is based entirely on that you don't love your neighbor as yourself and that you harm him. It's going to be the cause. It's going to be the thing. And we'll have some things to talk about how do you say it exactly without being too offensive? There's going to be some questions coming up as to whether we can expect the great white throne judgment to be as we have believed it will be. And I'll have some interesting things for you that come in that area. I don't believe that I myself will be subjected to being judged in that time. And I'll explain why that's going to be and how that you can have that same confidence going forward. Certainly not going to be condemned because I never harm anyone. And that if I don't do well enough in some measure, all that really means is that I didn't live my life to the fullest of my choosing and my capability of living it. It doesn't mean that I fail and that I get destroyed because I didn't do well enough. Doing well enough is performance, and it's legalism, and it's going after rules. It's going after religious behavior and rote and ritual and things that people try to do to add up on the pro side of their pros and cons list they believe God judges them by. And almost all of that stuff never makes it into God's scrutiny because God doesn't respect their persons and he doesn't respect their performances and their behaviors. He doesn't care about your behavior. He cares about whether you hurt people or not. Whether you think more of yourself than you do of them and think that it's okay for you to move to force and harm someone is all that sin has been. Sin is only harm. It's not failing to behave well. There's no such thing as a sin of omission. It's a fantasy. It's a myth. It's a religious myth. Since there's nothing required of you from outside of you by law, but is required from the inside of you that you love your neighbor as yourself, means that it could not possibly be that you can omit something like that. What's the omission? How do you omit something because you didn't love your neighbor properly? Well, you can withhold good from them, true, but you still get to choose because if you have it in your power, you get to choose whether you do that or not. So what are you going to omit? Are you going to be worthy of destruction because you didn't go tell them about Jesus enough times to force them to repent and become Christians? Are you going to go out there and do enough of evangelism works to make God respect you as a person? Are you going to have him respect your evangelism and therefore give you credit that somehow it absolves you of things that you thought were on the debit side of your account? Why would you expect you to have an account? Jesus talks about a book of life and those kinds of things. Record keeping and keeping accounts is what empires do to bind people. I don't really know. I'm really kind of surprised when I think about it, or not surprised after 38 years or whatever it is. I've seen it before. But why is there a Roman idea of keeping accounting and records of people in order to bind them and control them? Why does that make it into ideas about how God would deal with us? Or is God a Caesar? So part of the practical lesson from those ideas and that God does not look at people's performances and the roles they play and the performances that they do in those roles, doesn't measure them by that. And then what can we learn about that for ourselves? Then we don't want to measure that way ourselves, do we? Because take heed how you measure. Take heed how you hear, and because measure you measure, we measure back to you again. With the standard that you measure others, you will be measured. if God doesn't care about the roles and performances and the things that men do to have and gain and lose status between themselves and the comparisons that they do that are worldly, if God doesn't measure by those things in a worldly fashion but measures by the heart things and whether someone's harmless or not, then why would we want to look at different men and expect that one of them should be greater and one of them should be lesser than the other? Why should we give an unequal measure because of the success that men have or the failure that men have? Do you look at a rich guy in a Mercedes and a homeless guy that's holding out a sign asking him for $1? Do you see them as different? Why would you see them as different? You respect their roles, their personas. You respect the persona that the rich man puts on, and you disrespect and you look in a condemning way at the man who doesn't have anything, as if he's less of a man than the one who has something. So looking at looking at the idea that God doesn't respect the differences between man and their success, and it doesn't matter to him that they're all equal to him and that they're all the same, as full of life and full of freedom, and not to be bound by anything except for their inward loving command of themselves that makes them love their neighbor as themselves and measure them as their equal, then why would we want to do that? Why would you look at someone on TV and think he's more than the guy who's walking by on the street? What are you valuing? Are you looking at personas and valuing them? And are you in that going to be agreeing with God, or are you going to be disagreeing with God? If God won't do that, and James says plainly that he won't, and he's right about that, and I've explained now why, then why would you allow your measures of the valuation of the way things go for people in their lives to matter to you in one little bit? You need to stop it, because you need to take heed how you measure. Because if you devalue people because of their personas and the roles they play, you're going to be devalued not because of the roles you played and how you failed or failed miserably or did well at your roles, but you're going to be judged because you measured someone by a standard that God doesn't agree with and does not accept, and does not expect you to measure an unequal measure to someone. He expects you to measure an equal measure to him, to find that one just exactly as worthy of life and liberty and good things and blessing and mercy and all those kinds of things as yourself. And to measure difference comes from respecting the persons. And so I'm not really talking about, hey, don't worry, God doesn't respect persons, so don't worry about how well you're doing. What I'm saying is that you need to worry about it. If you do so, measure that way. If you do measure in that way, you need to concern yourself with that, because you are opposing God in being worldly, in that you've measured something to someone that has to do with the world and not has to do with their nature as a man. Their equivalent nature as a man to you, just as worthy as you to do well. And you can get offended because I said worthy. What do you mean? Why wouldn't you be worthy? If these personas and roles don't earn you any worthiness, then why would you concern yourself with those roles, and why would worthiness seem to be something that you continue to withhold from yourself and from others because of those measures? Worthiness is a weird idea when it comes to man. It gets some play in the scripture because guys are worshiping and saying that Jesus is worthy and those kinds of things. And men just continually will always say that Jesus is a different kind of man than them, so he's worthy and we're not. If I say I'm worthy of anything, then I'm going to diminish Jesus' worthiness by claiming that my unworthy soul is of any value compared to his. And why does that happen? You respect Jesus as person enough that you can't measure yourself as being his equal, being as equally a man as he is, and equally able to be righteous. And why do you have to continue to judge yourself as condemned? You have to make a bad comparison between yourself and Jesus in order to do that. Why would you do that? He came into the world to remove devaluation and condemning from the world, and he overcame it. He overcame that condemnation that makes you seem less valuable than he. What are you saying, Joe? That I'm as valuable as Jesus? Well, yeah, I think I did. Do I have to say it clearly enough? You're as valuable as Jesus, and what you judge and what matters to you and what you deal with and how you view things and how you love people and how you measure them is just as important as it was for him. He kept his priesthood and was able to do the things he did and to be a yoke breaker and a deliverer and a restorer of men because he didn't judge them as being unequal with each other. He measured them according to their property, what was proper to them, and he never harmed them, and his judgment was good. You know, he said, if I judge, my judgment is true. I'm not afraid to say that. I might think about it for a second. Hey, I don't know, say that on the video. Well, I think you might think that if I make a judgment, my judgment might be true. Because, you know, you don't make judgments all the time because you measure people equally. You only make judgments when someone's harmed. You know, the other judgments that devalue people are based in the error of respecting their persons or disrespecting their persons, and we've found that they can't be done right. Those judgments can't be right. They can't be your place to judge because you can't have a place to judge and decide for and measure and condemn or justify. Well, you can justify people, but you can't condemn them unless you're involved in something where they've harmed. Otherwise, you're just condemning them because you're a wicked measure of men. You condemn them when they're innocent and righteous, and you pretend that you can say that they're bad. That's not judgment. I mean, it's not good judgment. If you never do that, then you can say that your judgment will be okay. It'll work. You know, when you actively decide and maintain as your personal way of living and your way of measuring and loving people that you're not going to condemn them unless they harm someone, then why would you think that your judgment could be just as sound as Jesus's? That's how he judged and how he won, how he got glorified and got his rewards and those kinds of things. So yeah, that's kind of long, but we'll see. It should probably fit. So far, Facebook's still allowing me to put big old videos on my thing. We'll see if I can get that remission of sins thing actually done soon. I may write it as a chapter from my book and rearrange my book to put it in there, and then do the teaching on the video separately. I may do both of them. Not sure which I'll do first. It's been on my mind for a week, and about a week ago, I lay down in my bed to try and relax a little bit, get my back straight for a while, and get kind of, well, I guess I can tell you now that I've mentioned it. I'm stiff a lot of times, and I don't really hurt all the time, but sometimes I need to kind of lay down and get straight because sitting in my chair all the time, hunching over, it's not doing me that well. But anyway, I took my little board and I filled it full of writing as small as I could with my dry erase marker. Got the notes ready, so now my big board is full of the notes and it's ready to go. You're going to find out what binding and loosing is. You think it's a war term, but it's not. It's a judge term. You're going to find out how binding on earth it's bound in heaven, and retaining sins and remitting sins, how they match up, and it'll be extremely important to you. You know, if people would start teaching the things I'm teaching, they'd really get some attention. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, it kind of depends if you're in a church and they let you talk. If you're in a church where they don't let you talk, I'm not sure why you even go. How can you give if you can't give? You're just going to go there and be the audience member, you know, might as well just go to a basketball game. Half the time they're just talking about scripture verses and how they fit together, and it's really simplistic mostly. I love doing that, though. It was year after year doing that. Going to church with the revelation and sharing it and having the Spirit of God move within various members so that when we came together and gave the message, the bit of the message that we brought, then the message would be clear. People could hear what the Spirit was saying to the church. Really set my brother and I up really well to be able to deal when we went into church meetings in other places, to really have an ear and an ability to understand what the Spirit was trying to say. And then therefore lend ourselves to contributing. Okay, this is probably long. Half an hour. Let's stop.